Raymond Lockwood had spent a decade making sure nobody ever saw him bleed. So it was almost funny that the first face he saw, when the world swam back into focus, belonged to the one person who'd once seen straight through him. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, sharp, dark hair cut close, a faded scar riding the ridge of his left cheekbone like a signature the streets had left on him. In Baltimore, they whispered his name in loading docks and locked back rooms, the boss who ran the waterfront with a voice that never had to rise, the kind of man cops nodded at and rivals prayed about. But that night there was no empire, no soldiers, no cold gray stare that emptied a room. There was just a bullet buried in his side, a safe house plan gone to pieces, and his right-hand Marco crashing through the doors of the nearest public ER, because the quiet clinic hadn't been enough, and a dying king means nothing next to a pulse that's still fighting. And then, under lights so white they felt like judgment, a woman leaned over him and said his full name. Not sir, not, can you hear me, but Raymond Lockwood. Soft and stunned, like she'd been holding that name somewhere quiet for 10 long years. He knew her before his eyes could even sharpen, knew her by the small birthmark on her wrist, by the way exhaustion sat on her like a second uniform. Naomi Hale. The only soul in that whole cruel high school who'd been kind to the doc kid nobody wanted. The girl who'd once wrapped a gray wool scarf around his neck when the world had left him shivering. Only now she wasn't 17. She was 27 and 6 months pregnant, a black wedding ring hanging from a chain at her throat, a widow's shadow sitting in her tired eyes, working a double shift she couldn't afford to lose. She carried more grief than any one person should have to hold, and still her hands were steady. Still her voice stayed gentle. Still she remembered the name of a boy the world had thrown away. His heart monitor betrayed him with a sudden jump, and the most feared man on the harbor lay perfectly still, afraid for the first time in years, not of dying, but of what he was about to do next. Because what Raymond Lockwood decided in that hospital bed would rewrite both their lives, and nobody, not his enemies, not her ghosts, not the men who'd put a bullet in him, could ever have seen it coming. If stories about second chances, about quiet kindness, and about the people who still remember us when we're at our lowest move something in you, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the moment the coldest man in Baltimore opened his eyes and found the one kind face he'd never forgotten. Emergency room number 4 was cramped and stifling with the smell of disinfectant alcohol, but Naomi Hale kept her hands as calm as the surface of a lake before a storm. She had seen too many wounds in 6 years as a nurse not to know exactly what lay beneath the torn shirt of the man on the table, a neat round hole in his left side, its edges scorched, the kind no shard of glass or blade could ever make. It was a bullet wound. She knew that as clearly as she knew her own name, and yet when the pen touched the medical chart, her hand wrote 3 dry words, trauma from sharp object, then stopped, the ink gathering into a tiny dot, as if the paper itself were waiting for her to change her mind. She didn't change her mind. Some people walked through the emergency room doors carrying an entire world behind them, and years of instinct had taught her that sometimes saving a life mattered more than naming correctly the thing that had nearly taken it. The man named Marco stood close to the wall, his arms folded across his chest, his black eyes never leaving her pen for even 1 second. He wore an expensive coat, still wet with rain, and though he said nothing, his whole body was drawn tight like a string about to snap. When she set the pen down, his voice rose, low and careful, asking what she intended to write in there. Naomi didn't lift her head. She answered that she wrote what she saw, and what she saw was a man who needed to be stitched up before he lost any more blood. Marco fell silent for 1 long beat, then stepped 1 pace closer, close enough for her to smell the gunpowder still clinging to his coat. He asked whether anyone else would read that paper, and in that question there was something that was both a probe and a warning. She raised her eyes and looked straight into his, and what made Marco pause was not the fear he was used to seeing in other people, but the weary calm of someone who didn't have much left to lose. She said that in this place, she was the only person standing between her patient and the trouble outside that door, and if he wanted him to live, then he had better let her work. Something in her voice made Marco step back half a pace, his eyes shifting slightly, as if for the first time he was looking at her not as an obstacle, but as a human being. Naomi turned back to the hand holding the needle, and as each stitch closed the wound, Her mind drifted backward to another night, a night she had tried to bury deep beneath long shifts and unpaid bills. 5 months earlier, under rain just like this, she had been standing in a small grocery store on the corner, still holding a bag of groceries in her hand, when her world shattered in only a few seconds. She remembered the dry, violent crack of sound, remembered the strange metallic smell in the air, remembered kneeling on the cold tile floor and hearing nothing anymore, except the frantic pounding of her own heart. And then there had been a hand, strong and decisive, gripping her arm and pulling her out of there, away from the flickering neon lights and the screams, into the darkness of the side alley. She had only managed to see a tall figure in a black coat, to hear a deep voice telling her to keep her head down and not look back, and then, when the police cars came screaming to the end of the street with sirens wailing, that person had disappeared into the rain as if he had never existed at all. She had never seen that face. She had told the police she didn't remember much, and that was the truth, because the memory of that night for her was only a patchy darkness she didn't dare touch. Who that man was, why he had saved her, why he had vanished, she had stopped asking herself those questions long ago, because asking wouldn't change anything. Her husband still wasn't coming home. Naomi blinked, and the present pulled her back into emergency room, number 4 with its white lights and the man, breathing with difficulty beneath her hands. She cut the final thread, checked his pulse, then gently pulled the thin blanket up over him. In that moment, Raymond's eyes cracked open, gray and clouded by pain medication, yet still trying to hold on to her face as if he feared that if he closed them again, she would disappear. He tried to say something, his lips moving faintly, but she placed a finger to her own lips to signal silence, then bent down and whispered that he was safe now, that she wouldn't let anyone know who he was. She didn't understand why she was making that promise to a man she hadn't seen in 10 years, a man whose name made the whole city tremble. Perhaps it was because she still remembered the boy from years ago, sitting curled up alone at the end of the school hallway, his thin shirt soaked with rain, his eyes lowered, as if he had grown used to the world turning away from him. Perhaps it was because in her own life filled with doors slamming shut in front of her, she understood better than anyone what it felt like to need someone, even just one person, willing to look at her as a human being. Marco was still standing there, watching the way she leaned down beside the hospital bed, and for the first time that night, the suspicion in his eyes softened into something almost like curiosity. Outside the window, the rain kept falling steadily over Baltimore, blurring the line between past and present, between the secrets she was keeping and the secrets she didn't yet know she was about to carry. There are faces we think we have forgotten, but all it takes is one moment for them to rise from the bottom of memory, whole and untouched, as if they had never faded. When Naomi sat down on the plastic chair beside the hospital bed and looked at the man sleeping beneath the thin blanket, she no longer saw the boss all of Baltimore feared. She saw a 17-year-old boy from that autumn, and time inside her seemed to rewind like an old film. Back then, she had been taking a shortcut across the concrete yard behind the high school, where rusty trash cans and a wall stained with graffiti formed a hidden corner teachers rarely visited. She heard the sounds before she saw anything, the frantic shuffle of feet, the cruel sneers of boys who believed they had the right to be vicious. 3 or 4 boys in the school team jackets were surrounding a thin figure pressed against the wall, and even before she could see his face clearly, she knew who it was. Raymond Lockwood. The dockside boy, the name the well-off students at school spoke with contempt, as if poverty were some disease that could spread. He didn't fight back much. He only raised his hands to cover his head and endured it, and that quiet surrender was what made Naomi's heart tighten, because she realized he was used to this. So used to it that he no longer believed he deserved anyone to defend him. She didn't remember where she found the courage. She only knew that she stepped forward, her voice loud enough for the whole corner of the yard to hear, asking whether they weren't ashamed of themselves for ganging up on one person with 4. The boys turned around, momentarily stunned by surprise, then threw out a few mocking words before leaving, because even bullies didn't want their names mentioned in the principal's office. Once they were gone, only she and the boy remained, the boy sitting with his back against the wall, one eye beginning to swell, the corner of his mouth bleeding, and his right hand scraped raw from trying to shield himself from the blows. Naomi knelt beside him, and the first thing she did wasn't ask questions, but quietly opened the cloth bag she always carried, took out a handkerchief and a bottle of water, then began cleaning the wounds on his hand with motions so gentle that even she was surprised by them. The boy flinched and pulled his hand back, his eyes wary like a wild animal that had never been touched by anyone without pain coming with it, and he asked why she was doing that, his voice hoarse and threaded with suspicion. Naomi only answered softly that there was no reason, that sometimes people were kind simply because they wanted to be, and that simple answer seemed to confuse him more than the punches he had just taken. She bandaged his hand with her handkerchief, tying it carefully, then realized he was trembling, not exactly from pain, but from the early winter cold seeping through his thin, worn shirt. Without a moment of hesitation, she took off the gray wool scarf wrapped around her neck, her favorite scarf, one of the few things a child who had grown up in foster homes like her had truly considered her own, and wrapped it around the boy's neck. He tried to refuse, tried to say he didn't need anyone's pity, but Naomi looked straight into his eyes and said a sentence neither of them would ever forget. That this wasn't pity. This was because she understood what it felt like to stand at the school gate with no one waiting for you. In that moment, something changed in the boy's eyes, the hard defense he had built around himself suddenly cracking, and for the first time he looked at her, not as someone giving charity, but as someone who had lived the same kind of loneliness. She told him, in a voice so light it was, as if she were talking about the weather, that she had never known the faces of her birth parents, that she had passed through 4 different foster families before she was 10, that she understood very well what it felt like to be an extra person in every room she entered. And the boy, who had never told anyone how his father had fallen at the docks, or how his mother washed laundry until her fingertips bled, listened to her in silence, then said softly that maybe people like them were born not to belong anywhere. Naomi shook her head, and she answered that maybe they simply hadn't found where they belonged yet. That afternoon, when the 2 children parted at the street corner, the boy was still wearing the gray wool scarf around his neck, and he had tried to give it back, but Naomi smiled and told him to keep it, to treat it as a reminder that in this world, there was still at least one person who had once seen him. She didn't expect that years later, that very boy would become the most powerful man in the harbor district, and she expected even less that the scarf, along with the silent promise wrapped inside it, would one day return to her life in a way no one could have foreseen. Naomi blinked, pulling herself back into the cold emergency room, and when she looked down at Raymond's sleeping face, she wondered whether this man still remembered the boy from all those years ago, and where that scarf might be now. In the murky fog of painkillers, Raymond Lockwood drifted along the border between waking and unconsciousness, and in that place, the walls he had spent 10 years building suddenly seemed strangely thin. He had heard her whisper beside his ear, the promise that she wouldn't let anyone know who he was, and he didn't understand why that sentence touched a place in his chest that even he had thought had turned to stone long ago. He remembered the gray wool scarf. He still kept it, folded neatly inside a locked wooden box in his bedroom drawer, the only thing left from a time before he had learned how to make other people afraid, and sometimes, on sleepless nights, he would take it out, place it in his calloused palm, and wonder when he had lost the boy he used to be. That boy had died on a winter afternoon, not literally, but in the way a part of a person withers, when the only thing anchoring him to life is torn away. His father had been a large man with rough hands, and a back bent from decades of loading and unloading heavy crates at the harbor. A man who believed that if you worked hard enough, and honestly enough, then life would eventually treat you kindly. That belief had killed him. On that fateful day, the foreman ordered his father's crew to work beneath a crane everyone knew had been broken for weeks, because stopping to repair it meant falling behind schedule, and falling behind schedule meant money, and money was always more important than the lives of nameless men carrying loads at the docks. Raymond was 15 then, standing at the gate waiting for his father, so they could walk home together as they did every day, and he saw everything from a distance, heard the crack of metal snapping, saw the crowd rush together and then go still. He ran as he had never run in his life, but by the time he reached the place, it was too late, and what he remembered most was not the sight of his father lying there, but the way the men in suits came the next day, placing a thin envelope on the kitchen table with a few hollow phrases about regret. Inside that envelope was the entire value they had assigned to a human life, a number so small it felt like an insult, along with a paper demanding that his family not sue or file any complaint. His mother, a small woman whose eyes had run out of tears, signed that paper with a trembling hand, because she had no lawyer, no money, no one standing on her side, and she knew that fighting those powerful men would be as useless as punching a stone wall. From that day on, his mother took in laundry for the well-off families in the area, bending over basins of soapy water from dawn until late at night, her hands cracked and bleeding from chemicals, her back stooping a little more each year, until her own body finally surrendered to exhaustion before he had grown old enough to give her a decent life. Raymond stood beside the second grave of his life when he was only 17, and there, in the cold rain, he made the one vow that would shape the rest of his life. He swore he would never let himself be weak again, never let himself stand on the side without power, never let a thin envelope decide the worth of the people he loved. This world, he had come to understand, was divided into two kinds of people, those who signed the paper and those who placed the paper on the table. And he chose, with all the coldness and fury of a broken heart, that he would never belong to the first kind again. The path he took after that was not the path of honest people, and he had never lied to himself about it. He climbed up from the dark alleys of the harbor, one step at a time, with a mind sharp as a knife and a will nothing could shake, until the whole city held its breath when his name was spoken. He built an empire where no one dared force the weak, not because of mercy, but because deep down, every time he protected a dockworker from being exploited, he saw the shadow of his father. But power had its price, and that price was loneliness. Walls growing thicker and thicker, forgetting what it felt like for someone to touch him without fear attached to it. Until tonight, until a gentle voice called his name beneath the white lights, and a pair of hands trembling with exhaustion remained steady as they stitched his wound closed. Only then did he realize that through all those years, what he had wanted most was not power, but to be seen as a human being, just as the boy from long ago had once been seen, only once, by a girl with a gray wool scarf, near dawn when Naomi's shift should have ended. She was still lingering in the third-floor corridor with a cup of ice-cold coffee in her hand. And it was then that she began to realize her hospital had changed in a quiet and frightening way. At both ends of the hallway leading to Raymond's room, two men she had never seen before stood silently against the wall, wearing dark coats, their eyes sweeping constantly across the space like emotionless scanners. They were not hospital security. She knew that, because hospital guards didn't stand that way, didn't carry in their posture the deathly stillness of men ready to act at any moment. When she walked past them to check on her patient, one of them tilted his head slightly to signal the other, and she understood that every step she took was being watched. Inside the room, Marco was standing by the window, the phone pressed close to his ear, and his voice had dropped into something cold as steel as he spoke to the person on the other end. Naomi didn't mean to listen, but fragments still reached her ears. Words about someone asking too many questions. About making some name understand that the harbor still had an owner, even if the boss was lying here. About there being no mercy, if anyone dared try their luck at a time like this. Then Marco stopped, listened, and when he answered, his voice carried a certainty that made her spine go cold. That whoever was behind last night's shooting would pay. That it was only a matter of time. The man on the hospital bed, the man she had bent over only a few hours earlier to whisper reassurance to as if he were a wounded child, suddenly appeared before her in an entirely different form. This was not the dockside boy curled up at the end of the school hallway, not the vulnerable young man he used to be. This was a man whose single word was enough to set an invisible network in motion, a man whose absence for only a few hours was enough to make others circle and probe like vultures over a corpse, a man whose name could make people pay with their lives. Naomi stood frozen by the door, and for the first time in that long night, real fear slipped into her heart, not fear for herself, but a fear far deeper and sadder than that. She was afraid for her own memory. For 10 years she had kept the image of that boy as one of the few beautiful things left in a life that had rarely been kind to her, proof that her kindness that day hadn't been entirely meaningless. Yet now, standing between two men with darkness in their eyes, and hearing those cold words echo through the room, she was forced to face a question she didn't want to ask. Whether the boy she had once saved still existed somewhere inside this man, or whether the world had crushed him and made something entirely different. She thought of the hands that had pulled triggers, of the orders that had been given, of the people who might have fallen because of the name Raymond Lockwood, and a chill ran down her spine. Whom had she saved tonight? Whom had she promised to hide? But then, right in the middle of that silent panic, her eyes fell again on his sleeping face, and something kept her from turning away. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, the threatening air dissolved, and she glimpsed again the shadow of the teenage boy from long ago, the one who had asked why she was being kind to him, in the suspicious voice of someone who had never been loved without conditions. Naomi wondered whether a person could be both the man who made an entire city afraid, and someone who still carried one small fragment of kindness in his heart, and she couldn't find the answer. Marco hung up, turned back, and caught her standing there. And in the moment their eyes met, he must have read the fear and confusion in hers. He said nothing at first, only told her quietly that she should go home and rest, that she had done more than enough for one night. But there was another layer of meaning in that sentence that both of them understood, that she had stepped into a world where once touched, it was hard to pull free. Naomi set down the cold coffee, pulled her coat around herself, and as she walked out of the room, she realized her heart was still beating with uneasy, torn rhythms, caught between the fear telling her to stay away, and an old, stubborn feeling that still insisted the man behind that door wasn't completely the monster the whole city believed him to be. 2 days later, when Naomi had just finished the morning handoff and was gathering her things in the cramped break room of the department, a strange, expensive perfume slipped into a space usually familiar only with the smell of antiseptic, and she looked up to see a man standing across the doorway. He was in his early 40s, his graying hair combed smoothly back with meticulous care, wearing a perfectly tailored suit so out of place among the faded hospital walls that it seemed almost unreal. And on his lips was the smile of a man who had never heard anyone tell him no. Naomi had never met him directly, but she recognized the name when he introduced himself as Curtis Drake, because it was the name printed at the bottom of the debt notices that had kept her awake for months. Those papers with numbers that seemed to swell absurdly every time she opened an envelope. He stepped into the room as though it belonged to him, his eyes moving over the old locker, the worn plastic chair, and finally stopping on her pregnant belly with a kind of attention that made her skin prickle. He said in a voice smooth as velvet that he was very sorry to disturb her at work, but she had missed too many calls, and debts, as she surely knew, didn't disappear on their own just because people turned their faces away. Naomi tried to keep her voice calm, saying she was trying to pay it back little by little, that she worked 2 shifts a day, that she needed more time. But even as the words left her mouth, she could hear the exhaustion and pleading in her own voice, and she hated it. Drake came closer, and before she could step back, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that might have looked friendly on the surface, but was heavy with possession. His fingers tightening just enough for her to understand that she was being held, not comforted. She went rigid, her whole body shrinking under that touch, and one part of her wanted to slap his hand away. But fear of the debt, of her job, of the child in her belly kept her standing there motionless. He bent down, his voice lowering into a whisper almost gentle, saying he wasn't a cruel man, that there were always ways for a smart and beautiful woman like her to solve her financial troubles, and in the way he stressed each word there was a filthy meaning that made her stomach twist. Naomi opened her mouth to answer, but at that very moment, Drake let out a sentence that made all the blood in her body seem to freeze. He said, in the casual voice of a man speaking about the weather, that in any case, Trevor had promised him this amount would be paid in full, and a man ought to keep his promises, even after he was gone. That name, her husband's name, spoken from the lips of this strange man, struck her harder than any blow could have. She stood still, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had just tilted, and she blurted out a question asking how he knew her husband's name, her voice trembling beyond her ability to hide it. Drake stopped, and for one brief moment, something flashed in his eyes, a flicker of caution as if he had realized he had said more than he intended. But then his smile returned, smooth, sealed shut, and he only answered that in his line of work, people knew a great many things about those who owed them money, that it was his job. That polished answer didn't fool Naomi. In her mind, a series of pieces began colliding chaotically. because she had never borrowed a single cent from this man. She hadn't even known he existed until the debt letters started finding their way to her home after Trevor's funeral. She had always thought it was medical debt, the piled-up bills a widow had to carry, but now, standing in front of Drake and hearing the way he spoke her husband's name with that cold familiarity, a terrible truth began to open. This debt wasn't hers, it was Trevor's, her husband, the gentleman she had believed she understood down to every corner of his soul, had borrowed money from this man. For some reason he had never told her, and had carried that secret with him into the grave. Naomi felt the familiar world around her cracking apart, and she looked Drake with a new question weighing heavily in her heart, a question whose answer she feared. But Drake didn't give her a chance to ask more. He only patted her shoulder one last time, leaving behind the message that he would return, and that she should begin thinking seriously about how to repay the debt her family still owed. Before he walked out the door and left her standing there alone, swaying among the broken pieces of a past she had thought she knew. Raymond had recovered enough to sit up against the headboard, and along with his returning strength came the sharp habit of observation that had helped him survive all those years in the darkness, the habit that kept him from missing a single detail happening around him. For 2 days in that hospital room, he had silently watched the woman come and go as she cared for him, and what he saw slowly fitted itself together into a picture that made his chest ache in a way the bullet wound in his side never could. He noticed how Naomi was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, how she took extra shifts the other nurses avoided, how her shoulders bent under the weight of exhaustion she tried to hide, behind the gentle smile she gave every patient. He saw her sit for hours beside the bed of an old man who had no visitors, holding his trembling hand and listening to the same old stories, repeated again and again with endless patience. He saw her comfort a child frightened of a needle with a clumsy magic trick using a piece of gauze, and he saw her eyes light with real joy when the child burst out laughing. But what he saw on the third afternoon was what truly made his hardened heart tighten. That day, a discharged patient had left almost an entire meal on the rolling table, a sandwich and an unopened carton of milk, and Naomi, when she came in to clean the room and thought no one was paying attention, stopped beside that table longer than usual. He saw her glance quickly toward the door, a hurried, guarded look belonging to someone afraid of being caught, then pick up the remaining half of the sandwich and eat it right there, devouring it the way a person eats after being hungry for far too long, her hands trembling as she lifted the bread to her mouth. Raymond closed his eyes and pretended to sleep so she wouldn't see him watching, but through the narrow slit of his eyelids, he kept observing, and he realized the trembling in her hands wasn't only from hunger, but the sign of a body running on empty, of blood sugar dropping dangerously low in a woman carrying another life inside her. She was going without food. This woman, who spent her whole day caring for the lives of others, was slowly starving herself and her unborn child, eating scraps other people had left behind, as if even she believed she deserved only what remained. Raymond had witnessed many forms of desperation in his life, had seen people do terrible things for money, had seen both cruelty and cowardice in their most naked forms, but nothing had ever pierced him as deeply as the sight of this woman secretly eating a leftover piece of bread, with tears gathering in her eyes, tears she stubbornly refused to let fall. He pieced it together with what he had heard, with the name Trevor, knowing she was a widow, with the black wedding ring hanging at her throat, with the endless long shifts, with her 6-month pregnant belly and the exhaustion carved deep into her eyes, and the picture that emerged made him angry, not at her, but at the world that had driven a decent person to this edge. He thought of his own mother, of her cracked hands over the basin of soapy water, of the way she too had once gone without her own share of food so he could eat his fill, and an old pain he had thought had gone to sleep, suddenly stirred awake. She was like his mother, the kind of person who gave until there was nothing left, and never thought to ask for anything for herself, and this world always crushed exactly those kinds of people. When Naomi finished eating, she carefully cleared the milk carton and wrapper into the trash bag, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then drew in a deep breath as if pulling herself upright again, and in only a moment, her face had returned to its calm, professional expression, the gentle smile blooming on her lips once more as she turned to check his IV, asking whether he felt pain anywhere in that caring voice, as if she weren't the very person who had just had to go hungry. Raymond opened his eyes and looked at her, and inside him, something shifted forever, a decision's quietly forming in the darkness of his mind. He said nothing, only let her check his wound, but his gray eyes followed every movement she made with a tenderness he didn't even realize he possessed, and he told himself that whatever he had to do, he wouldn't let the woman who had once shown him the only warmth in his life eat scraps of leftover bread for one more day. That evening, when the hospital sank into the thick stillness of the late hours, Naomi's phone vibrated in the pocket of her white coat, and she stepped into the empty hallway near Raymond's room to answer it, never knowing that his door was slightly ajar and that he was still awake. The voice on the other end belonged to an employee from the funeral home, cold and formulaic, reminding her of an unpaid balance from her husband's funeral that she still hadn't settled, and every word from that person was like a needle reopening a wound that had never truly closed. Raymond lay still in the darkness, and through the crack in the door, he heard her voice change, the professional calm she always wore gradually splintering into something bare and painful. She told the person that she was trying, that she would pay, and then her voice caught, and perhaps because she was too tired, too lonely, or because in the dead of night people more easily let the dams inside them break, she began to say more than she needed to, as if she were speaking more to herself than to the person on the line. She said she still couldn't believe Trevor was gone, that everything had happened too quickly, and Raymond, though he knew he shouldn't be listening, couldn't shut his ears against the grief spilling out of that woman. She spoke of that fateful night, the night that should have been the happiest night of her life. That afternoon, after months of waiting through hope and disappointment tangled together, she had held in her hand a test with 2 red lines and known that at last, after everything she and her husband had been through, she was going to become a mother. She remembered Trevor sweeping her into his arms, spinning her once around their small kitchen, tears rolling down his face from sheer happiness, and he kept repeating that they had to celebrate, that a moment like this couldn't pass without something sweet. She had laughed and told him it was already dark, that there was nothing at home, but she had let slip that she wished there were a piece of cake, only a careless little joke from a woman floating in happiness, a sentence she would spend the rest of her life paying for. Trevor had laughed, quickly pulled on his coat, and insisted they walk to the corner store together to celebrate. Hand in hand, they entered the little grocery store, laughing about their bright future, completely unaware that it was being robbed at that very moment, and Trevor, trying to shield her when the chaos erupted, was struck down by a single, merciless gunshot. A stranger had dragged her away into the safety of the dark alley before she could even reach her husband's body, leaving her to watch his life fade from a distance. Naomi's voice broke completely when she reached that part, whispering the sentence she had repeated through thousands of sleepless nights, that if she hadn't craved a piece of cake, they would have stayed home, and Trevor would still be alive beside her now. She said she had killed her husband with her own happiness, that every time she looked down at her pregnant belly, she felt both a boundless love for the child and a torment no words could describe, because this baby would never know its father, and that father had fallen while going to buy a gift to celebrate its very existence. Raymond lay in the darkness, and he felt something wet at the corner of his eye, something he hadn't felt in 10 years, not since the night he had stood beside his mother's grave. He thought about the terrible cruelty of fate, about the way it took away the best people in the most meaningless ways, about the burden of guilt this woman was carrying on her thin shoulders, a guilt she had never deserved to carry at all. He wanted to get out of bed, wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that no one could blame a wife for craving a piece of cake, on the day she found out she was going to be a mother, but he knew he had no right, that he was only a patient who had accidentally overheard her most private pain. Outside in the hallway, Naomi hung up, leaned her back against the cold wall, and let herself slide down to the floor for a moment, both hands wrapped around her pregnant belly, as if she were holding the last piece left of the man she loved, and the tears she had held back all day finally began to fall quietly in the darkness, where she thought no one could see. 3 nights later, when Raymond was finally able to walk slowly along the hallway on his own, with the doctor's reluctant permission, he left his room near midnight to escape the restlessness that made sleep impossible, and his steps carried him past a door, standing slightly open at the end of the corridor. The door to the staff changing room. He had no intention of stopping, but a small light, warm and trembling, slipped through the crack and made him go still, a light strangely out of place among the cold, white fluorescent lamps of the hospital. He looked through the opening, and what he saw rooted him to the spot, afraid to breathe too loudly for fear of breaking the fragile moment before him. Naomi was sitting alone on the long bench between rows of metal lockers, still wearing her nurse's uniform, and in front of her, set on a paper towel spread clumsily across her lap, was a tiny cake, the cheap kind wrapped in a clear plastic box that anyone could buy at a convenience store for a few coins. A single candle stood in the cake, the slender flame burning, and its small light cast a pale golden glow over her face, trembling with every breath she took. She didn't sing. There was no one there to sing with her. She only sat there watching the flame burn, both hands resting on her pregnant belly, and in the absolute stillness of that room, Raymond realized it was her birthday. He watched her close her eyes for one brief moment, as if silently making a wish, and he wondered what a woman who had lost everything would wish for on a night like this. And then she opened her eyes and gently blew out the candle. The room sank into darkness for 1 second before the dim light from the hallway spilled, in just enough for him to still see her. And in that darkness, Naomi lowered her head, and her shoulders began to shake. She didn't cry out loud, and that was what made Raymond's heart feel as if an invisible hand had closed around it. She cried in absolute silence, the kind of crying of someone who had learned that her tears disturbed no one, and that no one would come to wipe them away. The mute crying of a person, too, used to having to suffer alone. She hurriedly wiped her face with one hand, then pulled the candle from the cake, and with a gesture that broke his heart, she carefully cut the tiny cake in half, with a plastic spoon, placing one half beside her on the paper towel, as if sharing it with an invisible person sitting next to her, someone who would never come again. She looked at that lonely half of the cake for a long while, then whispered something too softly for him to hear. But he didn't need to hear it to understand. She was wishing herself a happy birthday, on behalf of the man who was gone, holding the loneliest celebration in the world for herself, in a cold changing room, among metal lockers and the smell of disinfectant, on the first night in her life when there was no longer anyone left to remember the day she was born. Raymond Lockwood. The man who had witnessed every shade of suffering, the man who had given orders and endured them, the man the whole city believed had a heart turned to stone long ago, stood outside that half-open door and felt something inside his chest crack. He thought of the lavish parties he could buy with the flick of a hand, the rooms full of flatterers surrounding him because of power and fear, and he realized that all that wealth had never made him any less lonely, not even a little, just as this woman was lonely on the night of her own birthday. But his loneliness was something he had chosen, something he had built himself with walls and distance, while hers was something life had cruelly thrown at her again and again, a woman who had never done anything wrong except be too kind in a world that didn't know how to value kindness. He wanted to push the door open, wanted to tell her that she wasn't as alone as she thought, wanted to sit beside her, and eat the half of the cake she had saved for someone who was no longer there. But he knew doing so would intrude on the most sacred and private moment of her grief, would take from her the only thing she still had, the dignity of being allowed to suffer without anyone watching. So he only stood there, silently, guarding her from the other side of the door like an invisible sentry, letting his own rare tears roll down without bothering to wipe them away. And in that moment, a new vow, stronger even than the vow he had once made beside his mother's grave, silently formed inside his heart, that as long as he was alive, this woman would never have to blow out candles alone again. The next morning, after a night in which she had barely slept, Naomi began her new shift with legs heavy as lead, and a faint dizziness she tried to ignore, just as she had ignored every cry for help from her own body for weeks. She went into Raymond's room to change his dressing as usual, her hands still skillfully removing the old gauze, even though everything before her eyes was beginning to blur into shifting patches of light and shadow. He realized at once that something was wrong, because he had watched her long enough to know the normal color of her face, and now she was frighteningly pale. Tiny beads of sweat gathered on her forehead, even though the room was fairly cold, and her hands were trembling far more than usual. He asked if she was all right, his voice carrying a concern he didn't manage to hide in time. But Naomi only shook her head slightly, forced a reassuring smile, and said she was fine, that she was just a little tired. The moment the words left her mouth, the room suddenly tilted. The box of gauze slipped from her hand and fell to the floor, and she felt herself pitching forward, the world spinning before it went dark. Raymond reacted before he even had time to think. Despite the wound in his side that still hadn't fully healed, despite the tearing pain that ripped through his body when he sprang up too quickly, he rushed forward and caught her before she could fall onto the hard tile floor. He held her firmly, carefully supporting her limp body, and the small life inside her, guiding her down onto the chair beside the bed while calling loudly for help. Pain from the wound made sweat break across his forehead, and a streak of blood seeped through his hospital shirt. But he didn't let go of her, not for a single second, caring about himself, his hands, which were used to violence, now cradling this woman with a tenderness so deep that even he was startled by it. Another nurse ran in, quickly checked her, and confirmed that she had only fainted from low blood sugar and exhaustion. Then they laid her down, gave her a little glucose solution through an IV, and checked the baby's numbers again. Everything was all right, and Raymond only truly breathed out when he heard that. When Naomi slowly came back to herself, the first thing she felt was the warmth of a hand holding hers. And when she opened her eyes and realized that the man who should have been lying in the hospital bed was sitting beside her, with his face pale from pain and blood spreading across his shirt, a rush of panic mixed with shame rose inside her. She quickly pulled her hand back, trying to force herself upright even though her head was still spinning, and the first words out of her mouth were hard words of defense, that he shouldn't have gotten up, that he was tearing his wound open, that she was fine and he didn't need to concern himself with her. There was an almost angry urgency in her voice, the kind of anger that belonged to someone who had grown so used to carrying everything alone, that help from someone else had become a threat to the fragile pride she had left. She said, almost in a whisper but sharply cold, that she didn't need anyone's pity, that she had taken care of herself her whole life and had no intention of changing that now, especially not with a man she barely knew anymore. Raymond looked at her for a long while, and instead of pulling back or showing offense, he only shook his head faintly, and when he spoke his voice was low and slow, carrying a weight that made her stop and listen. He told her this wasn't pity. That pity was something people handed down to those they considered beneath them, and what he felt for her was the complete opposite. He said he had watched her over the past few days, had seen her give until there was nothing left to every person who came through these doors, without asking for anything in return, had seen her stand under burdens that could knock anyone down, and that what he felt when he looked at her wasn't pity, but the deepest respect he had ever given another human being. He went on to say that precisely because she was so strong, she needed someone, even just once, to be willing to catch her when she fell, not because she was weak, but because even the strongest people weren't born to carry everything alone. Naomi fell silent before those words, and she felt something in the armor she had built around herself begin to crack, because through all 5 months, between creditors, threats, and the coldness of the whole world, this was the first time someone had looked at her hardship and called it strength instead of something pitiful. She looked into his gray eyes, the eyes the entire city feared, and she didn't see the pity she had dreaded, nor the cold possession she had seen in Drake's gaze, but something so warm and sincere that her eyes began to sting, and for the first time in a very long while, she didn't hurry to wipe away the tear that had just risen. After that fainting spell, the invisible distance between Naomi and Raymond softened, and in the remaining days of his recovery, they began to talk more. Brief conversations in the quiet late hours when she came by to check on him. It was on one such night, when he asked her about her family, about relatives who might be able to help her now, that Naomi stayed silent for a long while before softly telling him a truth she rarely shared with anyone. She said she had never had a family in the way most people understood the word, that she had grown up in the foster care system, moved from one house to another, like an object no one truly wanted to keep, always a stranger at someone else's dinner table, always learning to make herself as small as possible so she wouldn't bother anyone. She said that through all her childhood, what she longed for most wasn't presents or toys, but simply the feeling of belonging somewhere, the feeling of someone calling her name with tenderness instead of obligation. And then she met Trevor. He came into her life like a miracle she had never dared dream of, not only because he loved her, but because with him, she received the thing she had lacked all her life, a family. His mother, Patricia, had welcomed her in those early days, and for the first time in Naomi's life, she was invited to sit at a holiday table, was called daughter, was allowed to feel that she was part of something larger than herself. To a girl who had never had anyone, that was more precious than gold, and she loved her husband's family with all the gratitude of someone who had finally found a home. But Trevor's death changed everything. Naomi said, her voice sinking lower, that from the day he died, Patricia had become an entirely different person, cold and distant, as if the only thread tying Naomi to that family had been buried along with her son, and as if the mere mention of her name had summoned her there. The next morning, while Naomi was at the nurse's station, Patricia walked into the hospital with a perfectly straight posture and the sharp, cold gaze of a woman who had come to demand, not to visit. She didn't ask about Naomi's health or about the grandchild in her belly, but went straight to the matter with a calculation that chilled Naomi down her spine. She said she had thought about it a great deal, that a woman in Naomi's circumstances, without a stable home, drowning in debt, working herself to exhaustion until she fainted, clearly wasn't fit to raise a child, and that for the baby's sake, the only remaining grandchild of the family line, she believed it would be best for the child to be placed in her care after birth. Every word struck Naomi like a hammer blow, because Patricia wasn't only threatening to take away the child Naomi had sacrificed everything to keep, she was denying Naomi's very right to be a mother, touching the deepest fear of a person who had once been abandoned. The fear that she would never be good enough, never worthy of holding on to anything she loved. Naomi tried to keep her voice steady, saying this was her child, that she would do anything to raise it. But Patricia only smiled a cold smile, and replied that the court would see the matter differently, that she had money, lawyers, and everything a penniless widow like Naomi didn't have. Then she let slip a sentence that made Naomi go still, a small detail that in her panic she almost missed. Patricia said she knew very well about Naomi's debt, knew the exact amount down to the last cent, knew even the terms she had to pay, information that should have been known only to Naomi and the creditor, details Naomi herself had never revealed to anyone in her husband's family. In that moment, a vague question swept through Naomi's mind like a cold wind. How could her mother-in-law know so much about a debt that Naomi herself still barely understood? But the pain and hurt of the threat to take her child overwhelmed everything, and she let the question pass before she could grasp it. Patricia ended the meeting with a reminder that Naomi should prepare herself, that everything would be easier for everyone if she cooperated, then turned and walked away with the decisiveness of someone who was certain she had already won. Naomi stood frozen beside the nurse's station, both hands wrapped around her pregnant belly in the way that had become instinct, and for the first time, she felt despair rise all the way to her throat, because now she didn't only have to fight debt and exhaustion, she had to protect her child from the very woman she had once called family, and she didn't know how much longer she had the strength to keep fighting. That night, after Naomi left her shift with her shoulders heavier than ever, Raymond called Marco into the room and gave an order in the quiet, low voice that the men under him had learned never to question. He wanted to know everything about that woman, about her circumstances, about the debt strangling her, and especially about the man named Curtis Drake, whom he had heard her mention in fragments of conversation. Marco, though briefly surprised by his boss's unusual interest in a nurse, still nodded and got to work with his usual cold efficiency, because in their world, information was the sharpest weapon, and Raymond's network of eyes and ears reached into corners the police couldn't even touch. Within 2 days, Marco returned with a thick file, and what he laid out made the already quiet hospital room feel even heavier. He began with the basic information about Curtis Drake, a name wrapped in the polished disguise of a respectable investor, a member of the board of directors of this very hospital, a generous patron of charitable funds, but behind that glossy coat was a sophisticated predatory lending network aimed at the most desperate people, those who had nowhere left to cling. Then Marco placed on the table a copy of the loan contract bearing Trevor Hale's name, and as Raymond examined each line, a cold anger began rising inside him. The original amount Trevor had borrowed wasn't large at all, but through Drake's sleight of hand, it had been inflated many times over, through absurd compound interest, penalties hidden inside tangled legal language that an ordinary person could never understand, turning a modest loan into a debt trap with no way out. But the thing that truly froze Raymond's blood was in the final clause, written in viciously tiny print, a clause stating that in the event payment couldn't be made in cash, the debtor or the debtor's heir could make payment through personal labor as designated by the lender. Raymond had lived long enough in the darkness to understand exactly what that disgusting clause truly meant, to understand exactly what Drake was aiming for when he placed a possessive hand on the shoulder of a pregnant widow and whispered about ways a beautiful woman could solve her debts, and the rage inside him rose so high that he had to clench his hand to keep himself calm. The woman who had saved his life, the one who held the key to his remaining humanity, was being slowly driven into a trap by a beast wearing a man's skin, a trap designed to crush both her dignity and her body. Marco continued turning through the file, and he pointed to the note about the purpose of the loan, one line of information that both he and Raymond at that moment skimmed over, without yet recognizing its true importance. In that section, it said the money Trevor had borrowed was meant to pay for medical treatment costs, and beside it was the name of the beneficiary, an unfamiliar woman's name Raymond didn't recognize, along with the address of a long-term care facility on the outskirts of the city. He frowned at that name for a moment, thinking perhaps it was some relative of Trevor's, a detail that seemed not especially connected to the matter at hand, and he set it aside to focus on the more important thing, stopping Drake before he had time to act. But somewhere in a corner of his sharp mind, that strange name was quietly remembered, a piece that didn't yet fit, one that would someday return and demand its place in the larger picture. Raymond looked up at Marco, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who had made a decision that couldn't be moved. He said this debt had to disappear, that Drake had to be stopped, but not in the usual way their world handled things, not with violence that could put Naomi in danger or drag her into it. He wanted everything investigated thoroughly, wanted every piece of evidence about Drake's illegal dealings in his hands, because he sensed that this man was far more dangerous than his polished appearance suggested, and that the fight ahead wouldn't be only about a debt. Marco nodded and accepted the order, gathering the file again, but before he left, Raymond called after him and told him to investigate that strange beneficiary's name as well, because the instinct of a man who had survived all those years told him that the smallest seeming details often hid the largest truths, and that the story behind Trevor Hale's debt was perhaps far deeper than anything they had just seen. While Raymond's network quietly dug deeper into Curtis Drake's secrets, the shooting that had nearly taken his life remained an unanswered question, and Marco had spent sleepless nights following every fragile thread leading back to that fateful night. What troubled him most wasn't who had pulled the trigger, but how the attackers had known Raymond's exact route that night, a route kept under absolute secrecy, and known by only a very small number of people inside the organization. It hadn't been a random ambush, Marco understood that clearly, but a trap set by someone holding inside information, and that cold truth meant there was a traitor among Raymond's most trusted men. When Marco presented that discovery in the hospital room, the air suddenly grew thick, because both men understood the seriousness of it. The person who had sold out the route couldn't be an outsider, couldn't be a low-level foot soldier, but had to be one of the few names standing close enough to Raymond to touch the most vital secrets of life and death, and that narrowed the circle of suspicion in a frightening way. Marco listed the people who had access to the information that night, his voice tense, and when that short list was spoken aloud, an unspoken truth appeared between them, that Marco himself was also on it. Even more than that, he was the one who knew the route more clearly than anyone else, because he was the right-hand man, the one who arranged everything. Raymond looked at the man who had followed him through so many years, the man who had rushed through the emergency room door to save his life, the man he had once trusted more than blood brothers, and inside him rose a bitterness he forced himself to bury deep, because the cold logic of the world he lived in told him that no one was allowed to stand outside suspicion, not even the man who had just saved his life, because sometimes the one who came to the rescue was also the one who wanted to erase the trail. and a heroic act could be the perfect screen hiding betrayal. Raymond revealed nothing on his stone-cold face. He nodded, thanked Marco for investigating carefully, and told him to continue hunting for the inside man with every resource available, keeping his voice so perfectly calm that not a single trace of doubt leaked out. But inside, the gears of his sharp mind had already begun to turn, and he quietly made a decision. He wouldn't confront Marco, wouldn't show any sign of suspicion, but would instead test the man in silence, laying small traps, releasing pieces of false information on purpose, to see whether they leaked out. That was how a man who had survived so many years in the darkness still operated, trusting but always verifying, keeping the person he suspected close instead of pushing him away. Because a traitor who had been detected but not yet exposed was far more useful than one who had already fled. At the same time, another truth began to take clearer shape in Raymond's mind, connecting two pieces that had seemed separate. Curtis Drake wasn't only the man strangling Naomi with a cruel debt. He might very well be the man behind the shooting, because for months, Raymond had been quietly putting pressure on the money laundering channels flowing through the hospital, directly threatening Drake's hidden kingdom. The two people he hated most at that moment, the man tormenting the woman he respected and the man who had put a bullet into his side, might be one and the same, and cruel fate had brought him to the very emergency room where Naomi worked, as if deliberately tying his two destinies, his two battles, into one. Raymond looked out the window, where Baltimore stretched beneath the night mist, and he knew the coming fight would be more dangerous than anything he had ever faced, because his enemy was not only hiding behind a respectable mask, but might also be standing right beside him, wearing the face of a friend. Marco had followed Raymond's instruction and traced the strange beneficiary's name in the loan file, and what he found was placed on the table in the form of a thin folder that Raymond decided to give Naomi with his own hands, because he felt she had more right than anyone to know the truth about her late husband. That afternoon, when she stopped by his room, he gently told her that he had looked into the debt, and before she could react to the invasion of her privacy, he placed the folder in her hands and told her to read it for herself. Naomi took the papers with hesitant hands, and as her eyes moved over each line, the color slowly changed on her face. She read the name listed as the beneficiary of the medical expenses, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 30 years, the name of the woman who had given birth to her, and then abandoned her at the doorway of an orphanage when she was still too young to walk, the birth mother she knew only through one faded line in her adoption file. Naomi stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands, and each piece of the truth began to fit together in a way that shattered her heart and mended it at the same time. Trevor, the husband she had silently resented for the past 4 months for leaving her with a mysterious debt, the man she had doubted in her darkest nights, wondering what he had hidden from her, had borrowed that money not for himself, not for gambling or anything shady as she had once feared in her imagination. He had secretly searched for the birth mother who had abandoned her, had tracked the woman down after all those years, and when he discovered she was lying in a care facility, waiting for death because of late-stage cancer, he had borrowed money from Drake to pay for her medical expenses. Naomi understood at once why he had hidden it from her. He had done it not to deceive her, but because he wanted to give her a gift he knew she had longed for all her life. A reunion. One last chance for her to see the face of the woman who had brought her into the world before it was too late. One chance for her to lay down the pain of being rejected that she had carried throughout her life. He had wanted to make certain that woman was still alive, still lucid, still able to meet her daughter, before he told Naomi and handed her that hope, because he couldn't bear to let her be disappointed one more time. But he had fallen before he could say a word to her, carrying that beautiful and painful secret into the earth, leaving her with a debt she didn't understand, and a resentment that now turned back and cut into her heart like hundreds of thousands of blades. Naomi sank down into the chair, both hands covering her face, and the tears poured out of her beyond her ability to stop them, but they were tears more complicated than anything she had ever cried before. The immeasurable pain of realizing the great love her husband had quietly given her, the burning remorse of having misunderstood him, and the devastation of knowing that the mother she had never had the chance to meet again might no longer be in this world. She whispered Trevor's name through her tears, apologizing to him for ever doubting him, even for a moment, and she felt as if she had just lost him one more time, more deeply and painfully than the first. Raymond sat silently beside her, not saying a word, because he understood that there were some kinds of grief that comfort only made cheap, and the only thing he could do was be there, present, so she wouldn't have to face this terrible and beautiful truth alone. He looked at the woman who had endured too much loss in her life, a woman who had once held a hope in her hands that she couldn't keep from many years ago, a woman who had lost her husband, lost even the mother she hadn't had time to find again, and was now carrying on her shoulders a debt born out of love itself, and he felt the resolve inside him harden into steel. He wouldn't let Trevor's noble sacrifice be twisted into shackles in the hands of a man like Drake, and he silently promised the dead man he had never met that he would protect the woman Trevor had loved until his final breath. That night, when only the two men remained in the silent hospital room, Marco raised the issue with the cold directness of a man used to solving every problem by the shortest path. He said Curtis Drake was a problem that could be erased in a single night, that all Raymond had to do was nod, and the man would disappear from Naomi's life and from this city forever, leaving no trace behind, no debt, no more threats. That was how their world operated, the way Raymond himself had used countless times to deal with those who stood in his path. And in that moment, one part of the old self inside him, the part forged from rage and graves, almost wanted to give the order, because Drake deserved it and it would be so easy. But the instant that thought formed, another voice rose in his mind, a voice from more than 10 years ago, the voice of a girl kneeling beside the boy who had been beaten down behind the school. The girl who had looked straight into his eyes and told him that he wasn't what the world kept calling him, that there was something good inside him that no one else was willing to see. Through all those years, through all the violence and darkness, Raymond had clung to those words like the last piece of driftwood from the man he might have become. And now, standing before the choice to kill a man who deserved death in order to protect the very woman who had spoken those words, he realized that if he followed the old path, he would forever become exactly the thing Naomi had stubbornly believed he wasn't. He would prove the whole world right and her wrong, and he couldn't do that to her. Raymond shook his head, and in a calm but decisive voice, he told Marco that this time they would do things differently, that they wouldn't use bullets, but the very weapon men like Drake feared most, the truth brought into the light. He wanted to bring Drake down by forcing him to answer to the law for every crime he had committed, so Naomi's debt would be erased legally, and she would never have to live in fear of him coming back. Marco looked at his boss with a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a little doubt, because this wasn't the Raymond he had known for so long. And in the very moment he observed Marco's reaction, Raymond quietly slipped a false piece of information about a location into the conversation, a small trap laid with the appearance of accident, then silently stored it away and waited to see whether it would leak. He still trusted Marco, but the trust of a man who lived in darkness always came with caution, and he wouldn't let anyone, not even his closest confidant, place Naomi in danger. When Marco left, Raymond leaned back against the pillow, looked up at the ceiling, and for the first time in many years, he felt as if he were standing at a crossroads where the path he chose didn't lead deeper into darkness, but had begun to rise toward the light, all because of a woman who had once believed in the good inside him when no one else was willing to believe. But Curtis Drake was not the kind of man to sit still and wait, and when he sensed that his prey was slipping from his grasp, that some invisible force was sheltering the woman he had marked for himself, he decided to strike first. A calculated blow meant to drive Naomi against the wall, until she had no path left except submission. That blow came down on a morning that had seemed ordinary, when Naomi had just arrived for her shift and was called up to the hospital administration office, where a female executive with a grave face informed her that a serious accusation had been made against her. They said a quantity of pain medication from a specially controlled category had gone missing from the department's pharmacy storage, and the electronic records somehow pointed directly to Naomi's employee code as the person who had accessed and taken those drugs. Naomi went still, her whole body turning cold as she listened to the accusation, because she knew with certainty that she had never done it, but she also understood at once that falsified evidence arranged, this carefully couldn't be the result of some random mistake. This was a trap, and she didn't need to think long to guess whose hand was behind it, because Drake was a member of the board of directors of this very hospital. He had access, had people working for him, and had enough cruelty to invent a charge that could destroy both her career and her dignity overnight. She tried to explain, her voice trembling with outrage, insisting that she was innocent, that someone had manipulated the system to frame her, but the protests of a young nurse, with nothing to her name, couldn't stand against the weight of evidence that had already been staged, and the result was that she was suspended from work, immediately pending investigation, stripped of the only income keeping her and the child in her womb from falling into the abyss. But the horror of that day did not stop there. When Naomi stepped out through the hospital gate with trembling legs and a spinning mind, a strange man in a neat suit approached and handed her a stack of court-stamped papers, and when she opened them and read, the ground beneath her feet seemed to collapse completely. It was Patricia's petition formally asking the court to grant her custody of the baby as soon as it was born, and in the petition, Naomi's mother-in-law had listed a long series of reasons meant to prove Naomi was unfit to be a mother, including the fact that she had just been suspended from work over suspected drug theft, a detail that had happened only a few hours earlier, and yet had somehow already appeared inside this carefully prepared filing. That timing should have startled Naomi into suspecting some kind of coordination between Drake and her mother-in-law, but in the overwhelming shock of someone who had just had everything stolen from her in a single morning, she was no longer clear-headed enough to tie the threads together. She only felt herself sinking into a nightmare with no way out, where every door slammed shut before her all at once. She stood there on the cold sidewalk, one hand wrapped around her pregnant belly, the other clutching the cruel stack of papers, and she felt all the strength leave her body. She was about to lose the job she had clung to with every ounce of will she had, about to lose the child she had sacrificed everything to keep, and about to lose the only family she had ever had in her life. All at once, all by the hands of people she didn't have enough power to fight. In that moment of despair, Naomi looked up at Baltimore's gray sky and wondered how many more times life could take things from her, and whether there was still anyone in this world standing on her side, never knowing that not far away, a man had silently sworn to give back to her everything that had been stolen. Curtis Drake had realized that attacks on Naomi's honor and her right to be a mother still weren't enough to break the will of the man quietly protecting her, and with the desperation of someone who felt his kingdom being threatened, he decided to play his most reckless and cruel card, using Naomi herself as a hostage to force Raymond to stop the investigation tightening around his throat. One evening, as Naomi was making her way back to her small apartment after a day spent drifting through despair, a car with no license plates pulled close, and two men dragged her inside before she could cry for help, taking her to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the old harbor district. They didn't dare touch her, because Drake's order was to keep her as a bargaining chip, not to harm her, but the restraint, the cold threats, and the damp darkness of the warehouse were still enough to make Naomi's heart pound wildly with fear, and she held her belly tightly, whispering reassurance to the child as if her own voice could create a layer of armor to protect it from the cruel world outside. News of the kidnapping reached Raymond almost immediately, and in that instant, the man who had always kept an icy calm in every situation felt a rage and fear unlike anything he had ever known surge through him, because this time what was threatened wasn't his empire or his own life, but the woman who had rekindled in him the humanity he had believed had long gone dark. But precisely because of that, he forced himself to be colder than ever, because he knew that a heated head would only put Naomi in greater danger. He couldn't rush out himself with his wound still unhealed, so he became the one directing everything, sitting in the darkness with the phone in his hand, commanding every move made by Marco and his trusted men, calculating each step with the precision of a grand master playing a game where the cost of one wrong move was a human life. And it was while he was coordinating that rescue operation that the small trap Raymond had quietly laid days before finally closed, exposing the truth he had both suspected and prayed he was wrong about. The false location he had deliberately revealed had appeared in the hands of Drake's men, and that meant the traitor wasn't Marco, the man suspicion had once fallen upon, but someone else. When Raymond's men stormed into the warehouse at the true location known only to a very small group, they discovered that the man who had sold out the route years earlier, the man who had leaked information to Drake, was a man named Bishop, one of the subordinates Raymond himself had once saved years ago, and had therefore trusted absolutely. When cornered, Bishop collapsed and confessed everything through tears, that Drake had found his weakness, had kidnapped and threatened to hurt his wife and children if he didn't cooperate, and that he had betrayed the man who saved his life not for money or hatred, but out of fear for the people he loved. In that moment of facing the traitor, Raymond, who arrived in time once everything was under control, understood a bitter lesson that a whole life spent building an empire through fear had never taught him. Loyalty forged from fear could always be broken by another fear greater still, and an empire standing on terror was as fragile as a house built on sand, because everyone had a weakness, someone they loved who could be threatened, a line that, when pushed to it, would make them betray in order to save themselves. He looked at Bishop, and instead of the fury a boss should have poured down on a traitor, he felt only a deep sadness, because he realized that the very way he had ruled for so long had created people who could break like this. But all those thoughts had to give way to the most important thing, Naomi. Marco found her in the dark corner of the warehouse, trembling but safe, and when the arms of the rescuers brought her out of that place, out of the darkness and back into the light, the first thing she saw was Raymond standing there waiting for her, his face marked by a worry he no longer bothered to hide. She staggered toward him, and without saying a word, he opened his arms and received her, holding her carefully as if he were holding the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, among the ruins of an abandoned warehouse in the old harbor district, they both understood that something between them had changed forever. But the horror of that evening had left its mark on Naomi's already exhausted body, and on the way out of the warehouse, she suddenly let out a soft groan and brought a hand to her belly. Her face turning pale as an unexpected cramp made her whole body curl inward. Raymond felt the change at once, and without hesitating for even 1 second, he ordered them to get her to the hospital as fast as possible, his voice urgent while still forcing itself to remain steady so he wouldn't frighten her more. As the car tore through the night, he held tightly to her cold hand, telling her in a low, warm voice that everything would be all right, that she only needed to breathe evenly and stay calm, even though inside him his heart was twisting with a fear unlike anything he had ever known. At the hospital, the doctors quickly took her into an observation room, and the first diagnosis made Naomi's heart seem to stop. The emotional and physical shock from the kidnapping, combined with months of working herself to exhaustion and not eating properly, had pushed her to the edge of early labor, and now the only thing they could do was monitor her closely, use medication to try to delay it, and pray that her body had enough strength to keep the baby safe for a little while longer. Lying in the hospital bed with monitoring wires attached around her, and the steady sound of the fetal heartbeat machine echoing through the quiet room, Naomi fell into the deepest fear a mother could ever know. Tears ran silently down her temples and soaked into the pillow, and she whispered prayers, not for herself, but for the small life struggling inside her body. Because this wasn't the first time she had stood before the fragile border between hope and loss. Years earlier, she had carried a hope in her heart that she had not been able to keep, a pain she had buried so deeply that she almost never allowed herself to touch it, and that was exactly why this child was so priceless, a miracle she hadn't thought fate would ever give her again. This baby was the last piece of Trevor left in the world, the only reason she had managed to rise each morning through the past 5 dark months. All her love and hope gathered into a life that had not yet had the chance to be born. The thought that she might lose the baby, after everything she had sacrificed to protect it, was a fear so great she felt she couldn't breathe, and she clutched the thin blanket tightly, softly telling her child to be strong, that Mama needed the baby, that she wouldn't let anyone or anything steal the baby from her. Outside the hospital room door, Raymond stood all night without leaving for even a step, his back against the cold wall, his hands clasped together, and the man the whole city believed had lost his soul long ago did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He prayed. He couldn't remember the last time he had prayed, perhaps beside his mother's grave, when he was still a young man who had not yet turned to stone, and his prayers now were clumsy and halting, spoken from a heart that had forgotten how to hope for good things. He prayed to some force he wasn't sure he still believed in, prayed that the woman who had endured too much suffering would be allowed to keep the one thing that still made life worth living for her, prayed that the innocent baby would be born safely. He was willing to trade anything, his empire, his fortune, his own life, just so he wouldn't have to watch Naomi collapse beneath one more loss, because he knew that this time she wouldn't be able to stand back up again. Through that long night, every time the steady rhythm of the fetal heartbeat reached him from the room, Raymond breathed out a little, clinging to that small sound as if he were clinging to his own hope. And in the silence of the hospital at dawn, the most powerful man in the harbor district and the most fragile woman in the city, separated by one wall, shared the same single prayer for a life that had not yet known the cruelty of the world it was about to enter. When dawn finally broke and the doctors announced that Naomi's condition had temporarily stabilized, that the danger had been pushed back, and that both she and the baby were being kept safe under close monitoring, only then did Raymond allow himself to step away from the wall he had leaned against all night. But he didn't go home to rest, because inside him there now burned an iron resolve, forged through an entire night of prayer and fear. Curtis Drake had gone too far, had laid his filthy hands on the woman, and the child Raymond had sworn to protect, and now it was time for him to pay. The old Raymond, the man forged from dark alleys and graves, had more than enough ability and means to make Drake disappear from this world in a single night, and no one would find him or ask questions. That was the familiar path, the shortest path, the path his instincts screamed for. But he had stood before the mirror in the hospital bathroom at dawn, looking into his own tired gray eyes, and he heard Naomi's voice again in his mind, the words that he wasn't what the world kept calling him. If he killed Drake, he would solve the problem, but he would also nail himself forever to the man he was trying to escape, and he would never again be able to look straight into Naomi's eyes, or into the eyes of her child, without carrying the stain of another life on his hands. And so he chose another road, the harder road, but also the nobler one, a road he had never taken through all the 10 dark years of his career. He would bring Drake down not with violence, but with the very weapon men like him feared most, the truth exposed beneath the light of justice. Through many years of operating in the shadows, Raymond had quietly gathered a vast treasure of information about powerful people in the city, files, recordings, evidence of dirty transactions that he had kept as a shield for himself, an insurance policy for his own survival in a world full of betrayal. And inside that treasure was a thick file on Curtis Drake. On the sophisticated money laundering network he ran under the cover of charitable funds and hospital investments, on the long chain of illegal transactions he had hidden behind the smile of a respected benefactor. In the past, Raymond would have used that information for blackmail, for coercion, for expanding his own power. But this time he chose to use it for an entirely different purpose. He contacted Dr. Angela Reyes. The honest attending physician he knew was one of the few people in the hospital who hadn't been bought and who had long suspected the irregularities behind Drake's role on the board of directors, and he handed her all the evidence, arranging for it to reach federal prosecutors and investigators even Drake's power couldn't silence. He did it carefully and intelligently, making sure that neither he nor Naomi would be dragged into it, that the fire of justice would burn only the man who deserved to burn. It was a quiet redemption, a moment when the man who had spent his life outside the law chose to place the fate of his enemy in the hands of the very system he had despised all his life, because he understood that for a woman like Naomi, a woman who believed in kindness and what was right, true justice did not lie in one life taken for another, but in the guilty being forced to answer before the light, and the innocent being cleared. When the final file was handed over, Raymond felt a strange relief, as if part of the burden he had carried for so many years had been set down with it. He realized that true power did not lie in the ability to destroy a person, but in choosing not to do so when he had every power to do it, in using his strength to protect instead of punish. And for the first time in his life, Raymond Lockwood felt that he was no longer the boss the whole city feared, but was slowly becoming again the boy from long ago, who had once believed there was still room in this world for kindness. The boy a girl with a gray wool scarf had seen and believed in, a very long time ago. During the days Naomi remained in the hospital for monitoring, Raymond quietly arranged everything. And as she gradually recovered, she began to realize that certain things around her had changed in silence. One morning, an employee from Drake's finance company came to see her, but not to demand payment. Instead, he informed her that the entire debt under her family name had been paid in full and wiped clean, that she no longer owed anyone a single cent. Before she could even recover from that shock, she received another envelope containing the ownership papers for a small, warm apartment in a safe neighborhood, and the name listed as the owner was Naomi Hale. She should have felt relieved, should have felt as if the burden that had been crushing her shoulders for all those months had finally been lifted, but instead, a complicated and bitter feelings surged up inside her. And when Raymond came to visit that afternoon, she faced him with hurt shining in her eyes. She asked whether he was behind all of this, and when he did not deny it, tears rose in her eyes from anger more than gratitude. She said she didn't need his pity, that she wasn't an object for him to buy with money and power, that she had carried herself through her whole life, and did not want to become someone indebted to a man like him, a man she didn't even understand, or why he cared so much about her. Those words struck Raymond, but he did not get angry, because he understood the fear behind them, the fear of someone who had been betrayed and abandoned too many times to dare believe that kindness could exist without a price attached. And in that moment, the man who had always hidden himself behind cold walls did something he had never done with anyone before. He stripped away the armor of power and let her see the real person inside. He sat down beside her hospital bed, and in a voice softer than she had ever heard from him, he said this wasn't pity, and he wasn't trying to buy her. He said he was repaying a debt of kindness that had lasted more than 10 years, since the day a girl wrapped a gray wool scarf around the neck of a boy rejected by the whole world and told him that he deserved to be seen. But then he stopped, drew in a deep breath, and said there was one more thing she needed to know, a truth he had kept hidden since the first day he saw her again in the emergency room. He told her that on the fateful night she lost Trevor, the rainy night she always remembered, as the night a stranger in a black coat pulled her away from the scene and then disappeared. That man had been him. Naomi went still, her breath seeming to catch in her chest. Raymond explained that the neighborhood where that grocery store stood was part of the territory he controlled, and that night he had happened to be checking on a nearby operation. When he heard the gunshot, he had rushed over, and when he saw a woman collapsing amid the chaos, with danger still lurking nearby, he had not hesitated to pull her out of there, take her to safety in the side alley, tell her to keep her head down and not look back, then leave the moment the police sirens sounded, because a man like him could not stay to answer questions. He said that night he had not known who the woman he saved was. She had only been a stranger in danger whom instinct compelled him to help, and he had carried that image inside him for 5 months without knowing why, until the night he lay on the emergency room table and recognized her instantly by the small birthmark on her wrist, realizing that the woman saving his life now was the very same woman he had saved on that rainy night, and that both times, fate had quietly woven their lives together before either of them could understand. Naomi listened to those words, and the whole world around her seemed to fall silent, because the mystery that had haunted her through so many nights, the nameless hero who had saved her in the darkest moment of her life, had in truth been right beside her all along. Tears rolled down her face, but this time they were no longer tears of anger or hurt. They were the tears of someone who finally understood that perhaps, only perhaps, she had never been as alone as she had always believed. When the evidence Raymond had passed along began to take effect, and the legal net tightened around Curtis Drake, he realized his hidden empire was collapsing, and like an animal driven into a corner, he decided to play his final card, one he believed would drag Naomi down with him. He had his lawyer accelerate the custody case over the baby, and at the hastily arranged emergency hearing, he appeared beside Patricia with a strange confidence, as if the two of them were allies in a shared scheme. It was that unusual closeness between them that caught the attention of Dr. Reyes, who had come forward to testify to Naomi's fitness, and when she mentioned it again to Raymond, one final piece suddenly fell into place in his sharp mind. He remembered what Naomi had once told him, that her mother-in-law somehow knew every detail of her debt down to the exact figure, information that should have been known only to Naomi and the creditor, a small detail they had both overlooked in the panic of that moment. Raymond immediately ordered Marco to dig deeper into the connection between Patricia and Drake, and the truth that came to light stunned even him. Patricia and Curtis Drake were blood siblings. The entire tragedy Naomi had endured for all those months had not been a string of random misfortunes, but a carefully staged conspiracy by two people bound by blood. When Trevor was still alive, he had unknowingly borrowed money from his own mother's brother, never knowing about that relationship, and after he died, those two saw their opportunity. The baby in Naomi's womb was Trevor's only legal heir, and with that child came the considerable life insurance money he had left behind, money Patricia would naturally control if she won custody of the baby. Their plan was simple and cruel. Drake would use the debt to strangle Naomi financially and emotionally, wearing her down until she was exhausted and defenseless, while Patricia would move to take the child by claiming Naomi was unfit to be a mother, and the two of them would divide the profit drawn from Trevor's own blood. The woman Naomi had once called family, the woman who had let her taste what it felt like to belong somewhere for the first time in her life, had never truly loved her at all, but had only seen her as an obstacle to be removed on the path to the money. But that very greed became the noose tightening around their own necks. When Raymond sent the evidence of the blood relationship and the financial motive behind the custody case to the court and the investigators, the entire scheme was dragged into the light. The petition for custody, which had been disguised as concern for the child's welfare, now revealed itself as a blatant attempt to seize assets, and it not only collapsed but turned back against those who had filed it. Curtis Drake was arrested on a long list of charges, including money laundering, predatory lending, and conspiracy to commit fraud, while Patricia, once her true motive was exposed before the court, lost every shred of credibility and was forced to quietly withdraw her petition, because now she was the one facing legal danger. When Naomi heard the whole truth, she sat in silence for a very long time, and the pain of learning that the only family she had ever had never truly cared for her, tangled with the indescribable relief of knowing that the threat hanging over her child had finally disappeared. She placed a hand over her pregnant belly, and for the first time in 5 dark months, she felt she could take one deep breath without fear closing around her throat, because the people who had hunted her in the darkness had finally been pulled into the light and could no longer hurt her. And when she lifted her eyes to Raymond, the man who had quietly undone each link of the trap around her, she realized that perhaps the idea of family she had longed for all her life had never truly belonged to people who shared her blood, but to the people willing to fight, to protect her, without asking for anything in return. Perhaps because her body had finally been allowed to set down the burden of fear that had pressed on her shoulders for so many months, Naomi's body chose that very moment of peace to be ready to welcome the small life into the world, even though it was still earlier than expected. A few days after Drake and Patricia's scheme collapsed, the contractions began, and this time they were not a sign of danger, but the announcement of life knocking at the door. She was taken into the delivery room, and the doctors and nurses, colleagues who had watched her difficult journey, stayed devotedly beside her with all their professionalism and tenderness. Outside the delivery room door, Raymond waited, and the man who had once controlled an entire empire with icy composure was now restless as a schoolboy, his hands clasped together, his eyes never leaving the closed door. This was a kind of waiting completely different from anything he had ever known, not waiting for news of a deal or a settling of accounts, but waiting for the first cry of a new life, and he realized he had never wanted anything in his life with such fierce longing. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, every passing minute heavy, until at last the door cracked open and a sound rang out, breaking the silence, the clear, strong, life-filled cry of a child who had just entered the world. It was the most beautiful sound Raymond had ever heard, a small sound that carried an entire universe of hope, and he felt something inside his chest burst open, his eyes stinging as he heard that cry declare to the whole world that she had arrived, that she was healthy, that she had survived. A little while later, a nurse stepped out with a radiant smile and announced that, although the baby had been born earlier than expected, the child, a little girl, was perfectly healthy, and the mother had come through safely as well. When Raymond was allowed to enter, the sight before him made his once hardened heart melt completely. Naomi lay there, her face pale from exhaustion, yet glowing with a light he had never seen before. the light of a mother holding the most precious thing in her life. In her arms was a tiny form wrapped in a soft blanket, eyes closed, little hands curled into fists, a small miracle that had overcome everything to reach this life. Naomi looked up at him, and in her tear-filled eyes was a pure happiness he was seeing for the first time, with no shadow of pain or fear remaining. She gently invited him closer, and when Raymond hesitantly stepped to the bedside and looked down at the angelic sleeping face of the baby, he felt as if all the dark years of his life had been repaid in this one moment. Naomi looked at her daughter, then at the man who had quietly protected both mother and child through the storm, and in a voice still weak but filled with certainty, she said she had chosen a name for the baby. She wanted to name her Eleanor, and when she saw the flicker of confusion in Raymond's eyes, she smiled and explained that during those long nights of talking by his hospital bed, he had once softly mentioned the name of his late mother, the woman who had sacrificed her whole life and gone without meal after meal so he could grow up, the woman he had loved and lost when he was still too young. She said she wanted her daughter to carry that name, in memory of a great mother she had never met, and so the child would grow up with a name that carried sacrifice and unconditional love. Hearing those words, Raymond, the man who had never shed a tear before any enemy, could no longer hold himself back, and tears rolled silently down his rugged face, because in that act of Naomi's, he saw recognition, an acceptance of him into the lives of mother and child, not as a benefactor or protector, but as part of the new family they were building together from the broken pieces of the past. And when he lightly touched little Eleanor's tiny hand and felt those small fingers instinctively close around his calloused one, Raymond Lockwood knew that from this moment on, his life would never be the same again. A few weeks later, when little Eleanor was strong enough to go outside and Naomi had recovered her health, Raymond took mother and child to a place he had never brought anyone before, a place he had dared visit only alone, and in silence for 10 years. It was Dundalk, the old working-class ground where he had grown up, and he brought them all the way to the edge of the harbor, where the aging cranes still stood silently against the evening sky, where the water struck steadily against concrete pilings worn by the years. The salty sea wind blew through, carrying the smell of metal, engine oil, and a past he had buried far too deeply. Naomi held Eleanor in her arms, gently rocking her so she would sleep peacefully, and she stood quietly beside him, sensing that this place held a meaning he had not yet spoken aloud. Raymond stood there for a long while, his gray eyes fixed on the water, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough in a way she had never heard before. He pointed toward one specific stretch of the harbor, and said softly that this was where his father had once worked, where that honest man had sweated through so many years with the naive belief that hard work and decency would one day be repaid. He did not retell what had happened, because she could feel the weight of it through his silence itself. He only said that every time he stood here, he felt small again, like the teenage boy he had once been, the boy who had lost the only anchor of his life and sworn he would never let himself be weak again. And then something Naomi had not expected happened. That hard man, the man the whole city believed had a heart turned to stone, the man who had kept his armor fully intact without letting a single soul see him break, suddenly let his shoulders collapse, and the tears he had held back through an entire lifetime finally burst free. He wept, not with the tears of weakness, but with the tears of an old wound finally being allowed to bleed so it could heal, tears for the father he had lost, for the mother who had worn herself down for him, for the boy he had once been who had been forced to grow up too quickly and hold himself together for too long. Naomi did not say a word. She only stepped gently closer, and with her free hand, she placed it on his shoulder, then rested her head against his arm, staying with him in that fragile moment exactly as he had stayed with her through the darkest long nights. In her silent presence, he found something power and money had never been able to give him. Permission to be weak, to be human, to hurt and be healed. She softly told him that his father would surely be proud, not because of the empire he had built, but because of the man he had finally chosen to become, a man who had used his strength to protect the weak instead of crushing them. A man who had found his way back toward the light, after so many years lost in darkness. She said the kindness he thought had died inside him long ago had in truth always been there, only sleeping beneath the armor he had been forced to wear in order to survive, and that she had seen it from the very first day. just as she had seen it in the abandoned boy behind the school all those years ago. Hearing those words, Raymond felt a strange peace spread through his chest, as if the burden he had carried for 10 years had finally been set down. He realized that through his whole life, he had always been the one protecting and rescuing others, had always been the solid wall no one was allowed to see behind, and this was the first time someone had stepped past that wall to heal him. Little Eleanor stirred faintly in her mother's arms, and the tiny sound she made rose like a gentle reminder of life, of the future, of all the good things still waiting ahead. 3 people, 2 grown and 1 small, stood together beside the old harbor beneath the fading evening light, and in that moment, the wounded past and the warm present merged into one, closing one chapter and opening an entirely new one. 8 months passed like a slow dream being healed, and the world around Raymond Lockwood had changed in ways even he himself had never expected. He had quietly dismantled the underground empire he had once built, transforming what remained into a legitimate water transport company named after Dundalk, the hometown of his own childhood, creating honest work for the laborers at the harbor, people just like his father had been long ago, so that no family would ever again have to receive a thin envelope in exchange for the life of someone they loved. Naomi had returned to the medical work she loved, no longer forcing herself through exhausting double shifts, and now she also spent time teaching young nurses, passing on to them the very devotion that had shaped who she was. One weekend morning, when warm sunlight poured through the windows of their small home, Naomi opened the old wooden box Raymond had always cherished, and inside, folded neatly through all those years, was the gray wool scarf from long ago, the scarf she had wrapped around the neck of a boy the whole world had abandoned. She lifted it, her heart filling with an emotion she could not name, then gently wrapped it around little Eleanor, who was babbling and laughing in the sunlight, and in that moment, the scarf carried with it an entire promise passed from one generation to the next, a symbol of kindness that had traveled in a full circle and found its way home. That afternoon, the small family returned to the harbor, and when the first drops of rain began to fall lightly, like the fateful night that had brought them together, Naomi looked up at the man beside her and softly asked whether he still remembered the girl who had wrapped a scarf around him all those years ago. Raymond looked at her, then at the baby in her arms, and he answered that he had never forgotten her for a single day, that the memory of her had been the only lamp keeping him from losing himself completely in the darkness all those years. Raymond and Naomi's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that one small act of kindness, even when given at a moment when we expect nothing in return, can still become a seed that grows through countless seasons of storms and saves an entire life. It reminds us that no one deserves to be measured by their circumstances or their past, and that true power does not lie in the ability to make others afraid, but in the courage to protect the weak and to choose kindness when we have every ability to do the opposite. Sometimes, the very people who seem to have lost everything are the ones who teach us most deeply about love and hope. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so we can listen together to many more meaningful and moving stories every day. How do you feel about Raymond and Naomi's journey, and what part of this story made you think the most? Please leave a comment and share the sincere feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to listen to your own story and the voice of your heart. Thank you for taking the time to walk with us all the way to the final lines. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, calm, and daily serenity. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.